So now let's go to what you call the fear of Dumsor. And then Dubik Mahama is here so that once you are done, if he has a question or two, he may make an intervention before he takes leave of us. And then you and then Alex Mould and Ejapa Mensah will deal with the issue of the Tor Torenko lease saga. So let's hear you.
Thank you. So, the issue is that I don't know what has been discussed before I joined. So I'm still going to give you a very short kind of overview of where we are as a country with regard to energy. And the key graphs are on the page. We've shifted primarily from a hydro energy system or a hydro energy mix to a primarily thermal and hydro mix. So in recent years, we get into situations where up to 70% of all our energy needs are met by thermal. The other important fact, what the graph is showing is that until sometime around 1997, 1998, almost all the power in this country was generated by hydro, basically Akusombo and Akuse dams, and now we have Bui.
That's right.
Then over time, we started to use more gas, LPO, and different types of liquid fuels to try LCO and different types of different types of thermal fuels to try and shift and diversify and improve the resilience. The interesting thing is that when that happened, private investment became much more important for simple reasons. Most private companies don't really like the hydro space. So there are not many places in the world where you see a lot of private investment into hydro. Thermal is much more modular, easier to modulate your output depending on how things are turning out, etc., etc. In simple terms, we now have a situation where the private sector is almost responsible for about half of total production, almost half. And that has also meant, so we had a time in the early 2000s where VRA, for instance, was responsible for almost 90-something%, either directly or through joint ventures. And now we have a situation where private companies are putting a lot of money into our power sector. So that is basically the context we find ourselves in. The second important context, and I also don't know how much of this has been discussed, but seeing the eminence of your guest, I presume they've delved into this already. But we've had situations where reforms keep failing. So there are dynamics around how usually when you decide to reform your power sector and you look at the entire value chain and you try and optimize the entire value chain, there are certain things that you ought to do. And even though we've tried to do them and we know what has to be done, we are not able to execute. Partly because, or I would say predominantly because, the political class is not ready yet. The politicians feel that the time that they have in power, the 4-year cycle, is just not really sufficient for them to think very long term. So if they can muddle through every 4 years and somehow get it going, they will do it. So their goal is not really to fix the system properly. Their goal is to patch it up, use Band-Aid, and keep the thing going as much as they can. And then when the next government comes, you come and take on. So that has been the problem. There are massive changes that we ought to be making in the system, where we have a situation where we have mixed ownership when it comes to generation. So when it comes to actually producing the power, there's private sector, there's public sector. When it comes to distribution and transmission, we have almost entirely public sector. And then when it comes to accountability for the losses, it's almost entirely within the public sector. That is not sustainable. You need to create situations where there are incentives to actually cut losses. And no matter what the very honorable and very eminent managing director for ECG may have said, and I presume, I haven't listened to him, but I presume he will have defended his position with great enthusiasm. No matter what it is that he might have said, the truth is most of the problems that we are facing are fundamentally as ECG. It's in the distribution, it's in the collections, it's in the retail segment, more so than the generation. Though there are a lot of problems also in the generation, but and I'll come to that in a second if we have time. But the ECG is the big problem. And we've seen an attempt to introduce private sector participation in ECG, and that has flopped completely with PDS. But their losses have continued to rise over time. And even though they've made some improvement in some years, like in 2015, 2016, much of that was generally because they were not producing a lot. And therefore, they were not producing enough, and therefore they were not selling a loss. As soon as production started to pick up again, we saw that the losses started to mount, hitting almost 35%. Then the World Bank introduced this idea of it's not the World Bank, the reformers introduced this idea of the cash waterfall mechanism. But we signed agreements with the likes of the World Bank, which require, therefore, that the cash waterfall mechanism be implemented and be implemented well. What does it mean? It means that there are multiple actors in the value chain. There are different companies that do different things. And typically, the challenge has been that because of poor optimization, this one owes this one, this one owes this one, there's a lot of confusion. So the idea was, how do we create a mechanism that allows the money that is coming in to be pooled? And then we don't wait a situation where Gridco gets nothing at all. but VRA gets something, the IPPs get something, maybe Ghana Gas gets nothing, and that kind of confusion. So we have a single pool. Typically, the ECG puts the money in an escrow because it's at the tail end. It generates most of the retail volume, and then that money gets distributed proportionately. Also, the other dynamic was that it gets distributed based on the most expensive debt first, so that we don't accumulate debt over time. So those were some of it's very complex, and I cannot explain it in a 6-minute conversation. But the key idea was we try to create a mechanism that will ensure that we are not creating distortions in the value chain. Unfortunately, that situation is not working. That really is where we are now. Because if the money that is being collected, people pay electricity bills in Ghana. If that money was being collected effectively and that money was being applied to the cash waterfall mechanism, we wouldn't have the situation we have now where consistently there's no money to pay the people that are producing the power. Where is the money that is being generated in the system going? That's a simple question. Recently, the ECG said the big problem was that people are not paying. So it went on a revenue drive, mobilization drive. And in the effort of through the effort of having done that, it said it has mobilized 3.1 billion out of 5.7 billion that it was owed. Two questions are immediately apparent. The first question is that if it's just 5.7 billion that is outstanding, and probably it's more by now because this is a few months ago, then that is not enough to pay the IPPs, the $1.7 billion. So there's some other value chain problems, regardless of what we do at the ECG end, which is important. The second is that beyond the fact that 5.7 billion, if you collected all of it, and raised about $450 million or so thereabouts, you'll not be able to pay the $1.7 billion. In spite of that fact, we also have the issue that the 3.1 billion has not been remitted through the cash waterfall mechanism. The 3.1 billion that they claim they've mobilized, which is more than $250 million. Because if we'd seen that money and we pass that through, at least the IPPs would have got a bit more money in the last quarter. I'm looking at some of the dynamics around the actual recovery rates. And if you ask VRA, they tell you that they get about 40% or 45% of their invoices. If you ask others in the value chain like Ghana Gas and the rest, they say they are not being paid at all. So the cash waterfall mechanism is not working at all. The recovery rate still, for most of the invoices that are being paid, is under 50%. So essentially, if we generate power or we transmit power or we distribute power, whatever it is that we are doing in that value chain, when we submit our invoices to whoever it is that we are supposed to submit our invoices to, the actual money that is coming back is often less than half of what it is that we built. So over the years, this keeps compiling. It keeps compiling. And then we face the issues over capacity. And it's because, we signed these take-or-pay contracts. And because we signed these take-and-pay contracts, what we have is a situation where whether or not we are consuming the power, we are still paying. That has some contribution, but it's not everything. It's not everything because even the state-owned companies who sell to other state-owned companies or elsewhere don't also get paid. So it can't be that, unless you are saying that they are also doing take-and-pay contracts. They are not doing take-and-pay contracts. So VRA, why is VRA not able to piling up receivables? Why is Bui Power piling up receivables? Bui Power claims that from around 2018, they had $300 million in receivables, which means that was money ECG should have paid them. They say it's now getting to $700 million. Is that take or pay? Where is that $400 million? Why have they not paid that? So clearly there's a problem across the entire value chain at multiple levels.
Right.
If you look at Ghana Gas, similar problems. So we cannot blame overcapacity alone, even though it has contributed something to it. Secondly, even if it's overcapacity, why then do we not reduce the amount of power we produce through those producers that we control? Why is Power still producing at the current volume that it's producing at, or VRA? Because if you have more from the private sector, it's too expensive, and until you can amend the agreements to reduce that output, then you have to start reducing the output from those that you control. So I don't buy the overcapacity issue. The key point is that every time we've had financial crisis, it's also been interlocked with a power crisis. And you can go as far back as you can. This on the screen, you see a number of instances where we get a debt crisis, then a fiscal crisis, then a power crisis, then a banking crisis, and it follows and follows and follows. And that situation is why I think all the issues we are discussing today are connected, because the truth is the lack of the power crisis has often been intertwined with massive political effects. So in the 1997, 1998, 1999 period, we had a power crisis, the government changed. We saw the same in 2007, 2008, the government changed. And we saw the same in 2015, 2016, and the government changed. So the government has to take this really seriously. The power crisis is almost like the crown of all the other crises as they compound. And often the political effects are dramatic. Thank you.